Look at that. What a good audience. Everyone's just quiet. It's 7 o'clock on the dot. The murmuring comes down. Yeah. Give yourselves a round of applause. So chokma sahochafo lawa mali nahola mamampa okano sahochafo John Hampton. I'm the director of the Mackenzie Art Gallery here, and I feel very privileged. Oh, there we go. Now it's a little more booming. I feel very privileged to be welcoming all of you here for this opening. So beyond its beauty, wonder, and magic, Shary Boyle's Outside the Palace of Me provokes visitors to investigate how... Oh, could we get it down a little bit? I think there's a bit of feedback here. Thanks. It provokes visitors to investigate how our identities and our sense of self are constructed, what comes from within us, and how external factors influence who we are, both individually as well as collectively. So as we launch the final stop of this tour here in Oskana-Gazistegi, Treaty 4 territory, then in the spirit of theatricality and also because I'm supposed to bring the land acknowledgement, I'll set the stage a bit. So historically, this land here is not the site of a permanent settlement. It's a space that many people passed through. It's the territory that has been and continues to be shared by the Saulteaux, Nahiawak, Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples. It's also been traveled by many peoples over time, including the Blackfoot. We then saw a wave of nomadic settlers in the fur trade expansion, then the creation of the Métis Nation, which was born through the mingling of cultures and traditions to create something entirely new. And the roots of our rich agriculture industry that surrounds us here took hold when land that had never been thought of as property was offered to European homesteaders who often left their own hardships and weren't fully informed about what they were signing up for. Clearing the way for this settlement, a fledgling dominion of Canada intentionally introduced disease and famine, decimating the sacred buffalo, an act of genocide for which the park that we're in is named Wascana, for the pile of bones. And then we saw the rise of this queen city where Riel was hung for high treason, for his role in the resistance, where universal health care was created, where the first arm's-length public arts funder in Canada was founded, where proud Ukrainian, German, Italian, and other communities made homes, where new faces, customs, and cultures continue to gather from Nigeria, India, Syria, and all over the world, who add new knowledge and customs to the land where Treaty 4 was signed and broken and is sought to reconcile, and where the second most widely spoken language is now Tagalog. So as all of us gather here in this exhibition and contemplate who we are and how we come to these identities that we form, then we have the opportunity to collectively decide how we will embody that history and who we want to be today and moving forward. So with that, I want to thank our funders, our donors, our staff, our volunteers for making programs like these possible, to the install lead, Levon Delorme, alongside our wonderful prep team, to our communications team for all the wonderful lead-up you've been seeing, to our admin team behind the scenes making it all work, to the Gardner Museum and Dr. Sequoia Miller for organizing this beautiful exhibition, And also thank you to the Mackenzie Art Gallery Operating Endowment Fund at the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation. Sorry, making troubles for our ASL interpreter, but when I say the funder so quickly. The Canada Council for the Arts, Sask Arts, the University of Regina, Sask Lotteries through Sask Culture, and the City of Regina for their ongoing support. And with that, I want to hand things off to our internal lead on this exhibition, our wonderful Director of Programs, Crystal Mowry. So, thank you.
Thank you for that setting the stage tonight, John. And there's going to be quite a few theater analogies throughout the evening. I'm sure it might get punny, so my apologies in advance. Shary Boyle is an old friend of ours. She's been here a number of times for exhibitions, for talks, and it is always a delight to welcome her back. Shary is among Canada's most compelling artists, working at the intersection of the personal and the political. Shary implicates our perceptions of virtue, knowledge, dissent, and belonging in a revisionist exercise. Beginning her career as a painter, her practice has expanded to include sculpture, installation, performance, and film. Shary was born in Scarborough, an area within Toronto that we both know well and over which we've bonded in the last few years. She graduated from the Ontario College of Art in 1994 and soon developed a studio practice centered on the creation of deeply imaginative, idiosyncratic, and unsettling worlds. Shary was an early innovator of live drawing techniques using overhead projectors, referencing shadow puppetry, and cell animation. She often collaborates with artists of other disciplines for these performances, activating her practice with a characteristically inclusive spirit. And I know Shary is going to talk about collaboration a bit more later on because there's a fantastic group effort that made this exhibition possible. Shary's multidisciplinary artworks were the subject of a major touring exhibition titled Flesh and Blood in 2010 and 2011. She represented Canada at the Venice Biennale in 2013 with Music for Silence and co-curated the collaborative touring project Earthlings. Boyle has performed and exhibited extensively from Los Angeles, New York, Paris, and Incheon, South Korea, to remote communities such as Dawson City, Yukon Territory, and Inuvik. Her work is widely represented in private and institutional collections, including the National Gallery of Canada, the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Museum of Fine Arts, Montreal. Oops, sorry, I kind of butchered that order. I'm used to seeing it in French. And the Gardner Museum. Shary's list of accolades and honors is long, including a 2021 honorary doctorate of fine arts from the Ontario College of Art and Design, University, the Gershon Iskowitz and Natishan Awards, and representing Canada at the Venice Biennale. Her work can be found in public and private collections, as I mentioned earlier, and we are thrilled to count ourselves among them. So sometimes I tell people, just ask us if you want to see something. Sometimes folks think they can't. You just have to call up the person who answers their phone. This exhibition is really special, and I'm not saying that just because I'm biased, and I've been deeply attentive to Shary's work over the years, but I've had a chance to see it grow over a time when all of us were experiencing such incredible change in our personal and collective lives. It's an exhibition that adopts the language of theater to explore the confluence of forces that shape our inner and outer selves. But it's also about the power that's inherent in a collective, a cast of characters who, through collaboration, can make visible societal change. It borrows its title from a line in Kae Tempest's 2016 song, Europe is Lost. And I was reading one of Tempest's collections of writings recently called On Connection from 2020, and I just wanted to share a little nugget because it feels so synchronous with some of the spirit of this show. A study published in 2017 found that while watching a piece of theater, audience members' heartbeats synchronized. They responded in unison with their pulses speeding up and slowing down at the same rate. Experiencing live theater performance was extraordinary enough to overcome group differences and produce a common physiological experience in the audience members. I'd like to think that tonight, in this space together, filled with all of this energy, all of these bodies, we have the opportunity to feel that same charge. This exhibition opened to a figurative empty theater. So Shary was working on it for a number of years, and then a pandemic happened. And it was one of the first projects that I can remember thinking, how different is an exhibition when no one is there to see it? And of course, its life changed over the next few years. That charge that I mentioned, that charge of having bodies together in the same theater, has been felt in Toronto, in St. John's, Montreal, Vancouver, New York, all sites where this project has toured to. And the Mackenzie has a unique role in this tour because it offers its curtain call. We're the final destination for this tour, and we're immensely grateful to the cast that have made it possible. So John mentioned our wonderful team, all of whom work behind the scenes to make projects like this happen. Shary is a mentor, a collaborator, a change maker, a dreamer, and a personal source of curatorial inspiration for many who are working in museums, and I'd like to count myself among them. On behalf of the Mackenzie Art Gallery, I'm so thrilled to be sharing this special project with our community, and I invite you to join me in welcoming Shary Boyle.
Wow, thank you, Crystal and John. What a beautiful settling and contextualizing of our place here on this land and in this moment in history. And I thank you so much for having me and welcoming me. I thank you to all of the team that makes the work upstairs possible and the group effort that goes into bringing a big exhibition to a place. It's a lot of work to make it look like it was just kind of landed there perfectly. So, but that, John, I really appreciate the historical kind of timeline that you laid out, because I find that so moving and so much of where my own mind goes all the time in trying to situate my own time in space in this moment in history, who we are, who I am. And I really love that. That was beautiful. Crystal has been a dear friend and a source of humor and inspiration and endless amounts of conversations over the years, and I don't know if there's going to be a lot of books left because they're almost at the end of kind of being sold out, but there is a book that accompanies the exhibition that's a very beautiful object, and you can see a copy of it in the show on a table that's free for everybody to look through, and in the beginning there's a little tipped-in conversation that's like a playbill between Crystal and I that took place 4 years ago. And so it's very interesting to revisit it now, and I feel like it's just as relevant as ever. And it's beautiful to have somebody, Crystal and I grew up in some of the same places, and so that touchstone really feels like home. So I can't see any of you because it's so dark and this light's so bright. So ordinarily I would love to meet people's eyes, but maybe later on in the space we'll have a chance to meet. I'm going to take you through some of the themes and the ideas that this exhibition is touching on, and how they work through me personally, but I have a feeling that everybody, and no, everybody has their own personal relationship to this stuff. As Crystal mentioned, outside the Palace of Me is a lyric fragment from a British artist that I admire very much, who's a musician and a spoken word artist, a rapper named Kae Tempest. And this is just a segment of the song. It's the bored of it all generation, the product of product placement and manipulation. Shoot 'em up, brutal, duty of care, come on, new shoes, beautiful hair, bullshit, saccharine ballads and selfies and selfies and selfies. And here's me outside the Palace of Me. Construct a self in psychosis. Meanwhile, the people were dead in their droves and nobody noticed. Well, some of them noticed. You could tell by the emoji they posted. It's a powerful song called Europe is Lost, and the whole album is really profound, and I really encourage you to look up their work. So selfies and selfies and selfies, and here's me. We grew up in, before the internet. I'm 51, so I thank God every day that I didn't have that during high school. Or especially middle school, because I experienced quite a lot of bullying as it was. Thank you very much, before having to have that online. So I'm very fascinated now by how we're all encouraged to kind of edit a version of ourselves for online consumption, which is international, global, endless amounts of audiences that could look at our private lives. How do we want to see that? That's so vulnerable to be sharing ourselves in this way, and encourage that if you want to be a successful, practitioner of contemporary life, that you too should have an Instagram account. Here I'm amazed too by the ideas of perfection and beauty and sexuality that go into kind of crafting these personas. And I think because I have the great privilege and tenacity and stubbornness to be an artist without any form of legacy wealth in my family, so this was something that my family was really freaked out about, me wanting to go down this road, because they couldn't really support me in it. And I had to find ways to survive over the years. But what it enabled, it was a life that I didn't have to directly create products that had no meaning, that were just distributed through the kind of production of capitalism. So yes, contemporary art very much intersects with capitalism and wealth, but it enables an artist to have a free space to consider the most pressing issues that affect them in their lives. Not everybody works this way. A lot of people just work within materials and experimenting with forms, and all of it is valid and beautiful. I'm a great, deep lover of handcraft and how important it is for humans to keep their hand skills and their handcrafts, and I employ a lot of that in my own life and work. But I also am thinking all the time about my position in space, in time, in relative history and politics, and also what makes me me, and what makes you you, and why do we look at each other the way we do. And that's so contextual, and it's cultural, and sometimes it's very hard to recognize how you see things, because we are the center of our own universes, every single one of us. And I've always been amazed by looking at people walking in the street going, they have just as much of an inner life and a massive orbit of family, friends, cosmology, kind of histories, relationships, and self-importance and sense of survival as I do. And every one of us has that. That's a lot of energy in the cosmos. So we sometimes forget that. We just see things through our own eyes. And so I started to break down all the time. When the Gardner Museum asked me, what kind of exhibition would you like to do? Because I was honored to be invited to make an exhibition. And I thought, I want to talk about all of these things. What makes us us? So I started to kind of break it down in my mind, now these intersections of perception, the way we see ourselves and the way other people see us. So there's race and gender, ability, disability, age, how attractive we are, how wealthy, our economy, our status in terms of prestige or kind of privilege, class. And then I also think about the things we don't talk about is what are the inner supports that you have through relationships, family, any kind of friendship in the world, because we need to belong, we need to be a part of a group, and that we're social creatures. So are we lonely? Have we been loved? What's the trauma? What's the support? What's your first family like? Your health? There's so many, the list can go on. And so I was just thinking about these amazing ideas of doubling, too, that we see ourselves, and then others sees ourselves, and then we also start to look at how others are seeing ourselves, and that kind of sense of double consciousness has been, explored by many amazing minds, and, and just everyday people forever, right? And we think of, say, Du Bois, the idea of a black kind of double consciousness, of the early kind of philosophies of people thinking about what's it like to have a black body in the States, and knowing that white people are looking at you a certain way with ideas about you that aren't shared of your own personal idea of who you are and who your community is. But then you start to see yourself through those eyes. And that kind of endless dissonance and kind of repetition can really make you a bit crazy. I think that this amazing scene from Jordan Peele, if anybody saw Us, the horror movie, where there's like the underworld and the overworld, and it's an exact doubling, that really touches on that kind of stuff. And it's really evocative because I think a lot too, I thought, isn't it fascinating that Jordan Peele connected race trauma with horror, and how interesting that is to use the trope of horror movies that so many people know about. They're very common, they're very popular, to talk about really deeper issues of fear and harm. I also think about, the distortion that we have, right? And the idea of how we have to manage our perception. And I really encourage everybody to read the new book, Doppelganger, by Naomi Klein. It's an extraordinary book about this idea of doubling, and how the way that politics right now are so binary, and how there's such a hard left and hard right, and the fighting going on, and why that's happening. I think a lot of us are very confused by it. She does a beautiful job of articulating how we got to this place. And it's really, I found it incredibly helpful. And I also am a huge fan of the Moomins. I don't know if anybody knows the Moomins. Yes. So beautiful. Tove Jansson, a huge hero of mine from Finland, no longer alive, a cartoonist, an artist, a playwright, a beautiful painter and drawer, and a writer extremely extraordinary of her adult fiction is so profound. So look past the Moomins and go into her adult fiction. A theater is the most important sort of house in the world, because that's where people are shown what they could be if they wanted, and what they'd like to be if they dared, and what they really are. So that's from Moomin Summer, Madness. That's one of her more children or all ages kind of books, and the characters say that to each other. A lot of things inspired the making of this exhibition. I want to lead you a little bit through. This is one of my first sketches I had when the gardener said, what kind of thing do you want to do? I knew right away I want to turn the gallery into a theater, because the gallery has certain ways that people go into museums or galleries and they look at exhibitions, and we kind of get trained as a way to be an audience in a gallery, and I wanted to disrupt that and interrupt it. And I thought a theater would be really interesting to turn the tables and get people, instead of being a passive audience, to think about how they are a performer in their own lives. And so what better way to do that than lead people onto a stage? So when you're entering the space, you're coming into what I think of as a dressing room, and you go under a proscenium arch, which is a classic kind of arch, and you're on the stage all of a sudden. You're being looked at yourself. And here's a little bird eye view. And instead of working with an exhibition designer, which is someone that sometimes is employed by museums to design the way that galleries show artworks, so they might have different displays or walls or change spaces up, I thought, why not work with a theater set designer, because they understand staging better than anybody. So I had a wonderful person named Shannon Doyle that helped me design this stage. And here's a maquette. Sometimes if you're doing a big show in the arts and you know it's going to have lots of iterations and time and space, and you can find the budget, which is a big part of that, you get to make this little miniature maquette of how the space is going to work out. So it's really interesting to me to look back on these pictures, because this is before it was ever put up in a gallery, and it really does look quite a bit exactly like that. So this would have been the first kind of 3D images that the gardener produced of how it was going to look in the space. And you'll see upstairs, they did a beautiful job here at the Mackenzie of creating a darkened space to enter the dressing room. And the way I think about a dressing room really is it's the space you go to transform yourself, to kind of look at yourself in the mirror and get yourself prepared for the stage or for just the day, whether it's your bathroom and you're putting your clothes on and you're trying to look somewhat presentable and you're going into a public space where people are going to have perceptions of you. And this is where you develop a kind of perception of yourself. So when you enter the dressing room, you're seeing these 3 figures and you go up to them closely to look at them, and you realize that maybe on the other side of the glass, somebody's looking at them on the other side, and you realize then this is kind of a two-way mirror. So the show starts with surveillance and a spectatorship of the other people looking at the piece as you look at them. Here we are kind of entering the stage, and again, you get to turn the tables from being a passive audience. Another thing that I made a decision about was to have no labels in the exhibition. So there's no didactic text on the wall, which is where you see text that explain to you what you're looking at, or credits that tell you the titles of the pieces, the materials. I chose not to have those as a part of the exhibition. There's a small playbill, which is like a brochure as you go in, and that's something you can take home or you can recycle at the end. But all of that information is in there, so it is available, but it's up to you as the audience to go into that space and determine how your responses are and what questions you have, dependent on who you are as a person and your individual and very unique experience in the world. So every one of these works that you're encountering is going to land differently depending on what your history is. And I wanted that to be free and open for people to try to figure out what these things are, because I want you to have the agency to ask the questions and the empowerment to give yourself the answers. Sometimes in museums, it can feel like school, and it can feel like there's an authority telling you. And sometimes I feel when you take when you give them an authority of what the right answer is, people become kind of passive. And they say, okay, that's all I need to know. And they check the box and walk away. But if you're not given, you have to dig a little bit. And hopefully it awakens your curiosity. I make ceramics. I've been working with ceramics as a sculptor. I was never trained as a potter, but I kind of was always really curious about clay, and I came through it by hobbyists, like going into hobbyist workshops and slowly teaching myself through those workshops how to work with it in the way I wanted to as a sculptural material. And I've always been very fascinated by figurines and figure groupings that are made in clay. I've researched a lot of European kind of porcelain figure groupings, and then I've taken that into all sorts of different clays. This piece is in terracotta, and it has a wood base that was carved by a friend of mine named Yorgo Liapis in Toronto, who's a woodworker. And I asked him to make me a little base that has lily of the valley and poison ivy, because those are 2 plants that I grew up and really informed my childhood around the places where I lived in Scarborough. This is kind of a piece that's referencing a Hummel figurine, which is an old kind of German-made tchotchke that soldiers brought back after the Second World War. And you could see them in some little houses of like crying little children with like a bindle stick and a little pork pie hat. And they'd be around often like the working class decorations. And I was interested in how those little figurines worked in our ideas and imaginations. For me, this is a self-portrait of me kind of leaving Scarborough. And there's all sorts of details, like a kind of going out to find your fortune, like an old fairy tale. And the head I put on is actually a figure from medieval marginalia within Christian manuscripts, because I come from a Christian tradition as a white European person with Irish and British and Scottish history in my family. But my mother and I was very Christian, and I went to Sunday school often, and I always wondered about the origins of kind of misogyny and the origins of misanthropy in our white kind of culture of European life. And I realized that is actually baked into early Christianity, sadly, because there's a lot of beautiful teachings that come through Christianity, and there's a lot of fear of the other and repressive traditions that come through that as well. So I've been untangling that as an adult. Here is a piece that kind of considers the clay traditions of the world and how we are informed by artists and cultural traditions. There's every culture in the world has some kind of ceramic relationship. So in here, this kind of terracotta baked earth figure without a head, the stack of pots kind of inform or suggest head, which could be a vessel for knowledge, a vessel for history, a vessel for experience. And so that vessel, which is a metaphor for the body, can also be a metaphor for character or identity. There's a Chinese pot, a pot from Africa, a European pot from France. There's one from Greece. On top of that is Egypt, and at the very top is a Peruvian pot. Here's kind of a Meissen-like figure. That's a German porcelain tradition that I was really interested in the group and the figurines. And I made a character that was kind of the artist, historical idea, imagined idea of the artist, but I left her without a face. And I drew the face in ink on the mirror. So you'll go up and see that piece, and you have to kind of use your body to line up the face on the mirror to reflect back on the face of her head. And it really is about the creation of ourselves. And I'm very curious about how artists create ourselves. I read somewhere, and I'm sorry that I can't remember who said this, but they said, when I go into the studio, I dissemble, and then I make myself again every day. And I thought, that's actually really real, because if you're an artist, we're a visual artist, not everybody has a practice like this. A lot of people have practices that are very social. My practice is traditionally kind of solitary, and so I spend a ton of time alone. And there really is something about going into a studio and shutting the door if you're lucky enough to have a studio. And once you're in any private room, you can just let everything go about who you are in the world and just retreat to your imagination. And then you kind of reassemble yourself through that process over the day. So a lot of images you'll see through the show are artists making like portraits or characters or sculptures that are heads, or it's something about my thoughts of self-determination, self-creation. I'm also interested in the cephalophoric saint, which is something I just discovered some years ago, that there is also a character in like some Christian stories and traditions of a saint who has been beheaded, and then their head continues to speak and proselytize the Bible, which is obviously a miracle. And there are some medieval sculptures that you can find of, someone standing there with their head in their arm and the person still speaking away. That's a cephalophoric saint. And I was amazed to learn about this, and so I created a lithograph. There's a little kind of drawing I made there on the left and a sketch for a lithograph, and you'll look in, it's kind of on its own, but it's a lithograph I made at NASCAD some years ago. There you go. That's me. That's the stone on the left in the studio as I was having that stone kind of put onto the ink and the image put onto the stone, and that's the final print. On the head is a wig stand, and that's an old European object that people that wore wigs used to have, of a certain class. They would have this spherical porcelain object the size of a head in their dressing room that they'd rest their wigs on. Justin Capoletti is a collaborator I've had in Toronto before when I've wanted to work with acrylic nail artists, because he's an extraordinary artist of acrylic nails. He works with drag artists often. He created that set for this hand. And the little peacock spider on top, you maybe have seen him on the internet. He's an Australian spider, just like the teeniest, like just a couple millimeters high, but the most extraordinary colorings. And the mating dance is very fantastic. So I was really interested too in how we adorn and decorate ourselves to attract each other and kind of present ourselves in the world. Here's some of Pinky, Justin works for Pinky's, and that's some of his nails that he's done. They're amazing. And this is called Oasis, and I often think of the gender fluidity of this beautiful body that contains all the kind of gender markings, but is without any ability to try to really say who you are, what you are in terms of gender. You're everything. You're all everything. You're nothing. Where does it land? I love this image. I tried to make something very iconic and beautiful because I imagined it being buried, and 500 years from now, somebody digging it up to find out, who is this person or culture that would make such an image? They must have worshipped this. Again, there's some trans history through Mary Ann Talbot, who became John Taylor, and lived as John Taylor, as a trans man. And this is a kind of old British character story that's, there's some people are not sure if they actually existed, but there's a lot of historical documentation that they did, and that this person, this trans man, identified as a man and went into the Navy as a man in England. And that character that I found through a porcelain figurine in a book about ceramics really charged me to look into their history, because I hadn't seen those histories very often when I looked into, portraiture of a certain European period. So I was really amazed by that person's story. And I wanted to make another homage of them in the Staffordshire tradition, which is a ceramic tradition from England in the 18th century. And this is a flat back, so it's flat on the back, which meant it would have sat up on the mantle of a working class home as a decoration again. And kind of being a part of the news that people would have. This image at the top that says "by image," this piece is called "by my image." Back in England, and that is what that is. That image is an old etching from a song, like a ballad. Music notes that would be a popular ballad, that you could take these pieces of paper that would be sold for cheap, and you could take them home and play them on the piano. And the popular tune of the day in London was called "By Image." And what that meant was that there would be figurine sellers on the streets, and they would sell these little ceramic figurines of news items of the day, situations that had just happened, maybe exciting tabloid type situations would be quickly crafted into a ceramic figurine and cast in a multiple for people to buy, like a newspaper. And there was a song called "By Image," and they would call the figurines images, which is so interesting to me, because we think of the word image as something very different than a three-dimensional figure. But that at that moment in the language, they'd call them images. So I made this character, John Taylor, with these little images of figures on the left and on the right that they're selling, perhaps. And on the left is the Venus del Holes, which is one of the oldest known figurines that have been kind of dug up through ancient times in the area that now would be known as Germany. But at that time, there's this mysterious figure. So basically, humans have been making figures of ourselves forever. We're quite obsessed with ourselves and remain so to this day, to the detriment of maybe the earth, because we forget that we share the earth with all the living creatures and all the living plants and soils and airs and waters that have as equal right to be thriving and safe and healthy as any of us. As you go through the stage, you'll see this kind of life-size character over there, and that's Judy. And here's my original sketch. I really wanted to make a wax mannequin. I've been fascinated by those forever, and I thought, how could I make one? So I found a person in Niagara Falls that had a job that over 30 years, kind of repairing the figurines in Niagara Falls, Ripley's Believe It or Not, Madame Tussauds, that kind of thing. And they had skills that they could teach me, so I went to work with them, Anton Gosley. And through Anton, I made this figurine that for me was inspired as the stagehand, because I've done theater before, and I'm always amazed by the people that are behind the stage that are making everything run smoothly. They're wearing black, they're know kind of everything that's going on, but they don't get a lot of credit. And I wanted to make an image called Judy, which is also a name for a dressmaker's dummy. That's a colloquial, sometimes people call them a Judy. So if you've made patterns. And then there's Punch and Judy, which is an old British, really ancient puppet show that is kind of like an original slapstick comedy that breaks down the kind of gendered, heterosexual, the old husband and the old wife in really brutal archetypes, but that's actually informed a lot of popular culture that we're not even aware of anymore. So I want to do a work about how gender and being a woman and the kind of archetypes of, say, European or kind of colonial female archetypes inform an experience of being on the earth. So this is Judy. She has a witch and another Judy. That's the little Judy wife on the left, and the Wicked Witch of the East. And there's the characters that, as I was making the hand puppets out of clay, there they are before they got assembled. And here's, the activist as well. And this is Angela Davis from the Panthers, but she has a long career of, intellectual kind of contributions to ideas of race and gender and liberation. So these are all things that women can feel kind of either inspired or slotted into. This little character, I did a workshop to make a marionette with a Russian marionette artist who was really skilled and was giving people, you could take a weekend workshop. I made this marionette, and in the end, I think it's it was like a spiritual portrait of my mother. It doesn't look like my mother, but I think of them as the worrier, because my mother was a great worrier. Here's some of the Clifton Hall, Niagara Falls scenes of like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix as wax groovy characters. And here's Anton. I used an old child. It was like a young boy's, but it's quite large figurine underneath the sculpt that I made to make Judy. So I was working with him at his workshop. He helped me cast the wax head that I sculpted out of plasticine. Here's me putting in the eyes. I made the eyes in my studio out of porcelain. And then I worked with Evan Penny, who's a hyperreal artist based in Toronto that does extraordinary hyperrealistic sculptures made out of silicone. And so he comes out of kind of movie magic background, so he's got all these wild skills from the movie industry. And he helped me cast the hand, Judy's hand, because I had to make it out of silicone, not wax. The wax was too fragile because I wanted to embed animatronics and make this thing move. So you'll see there's a few pieces in the show where I wasn't really content for the work just to be figurative or even look really real. I wanted it to also, like Giuseppe of Pinocchio, kind of come to life. I also work with Grant Heaps, who's a friend of mine. He works at the National Ballet to repair and restore the dancers' costumes, and he's been there for 20 years, but he's also a brilliant textile artist. And I asked him to come in with me to do some of the sewing of the more fragile parts of centering, which when you go on stage, you'll see this sculpture that is based on top of a pottery wheel, an active, real, functional pottery wheel that you can interact with by putting a coin in the machine, putting your foot on the pedal, and if you've ever done any kind of wheel work some people have tried that out on the wheel, you can make it spin. And when it spins, it flies up her costume, and it really is about kind of the star of the show. Center stage, glamour, status, fame, the attention, the economy of attention, and how deeply we all desire attention, probably coming from just a need to be witnessed and seen and loved. Very common, very human, but it's kind of, in capitalism, got away from us a little bit, and it's turned into a kind of craze, right? So I'm interested in the idea of how, we all want to kind of be the center of the spotlight. I've been raising money with this thing, I have to say. It all goes to charity. Every, like a good organization is chosen, and for most of the tour in Canada, it's gone to Inspiration Studio, which is an organization that I work with that teaches pottery skills to people that are coming out of difficult situations, and they kind of learn a new skill, a new identity, a little community, and kind of something that they can also supplement their income with. It's a brilliant program, 30 years old, so I raised about $12,000 through this coin machine over the course of 3 years for that organization. And here we have an organization that's been chosen by the Mackenzie around the, I'm not familiar with it, but it says on the plinth, it's a Treaty 4 organization downtown for people that are probably, I'm not sure exactly if it's involved with the arts or just a support organization, but all money, 100%, will go to support that organization locally. The procession is something I'm also interested in because of the way that a parade or a protest brings people together of all backgrounds to make a kind of community change or community celebration. When I first made the work, that's multiple small black clay figurines you'll see in there, I thought that I would use real spotlights because I have a history of working with the overhead projector and theater, and I wanted to make it about the shadow plays that I used to do. But it's just impossible to have a dark enough space to get really good projections at the same time as seeing the rest of the art in the show. show. So I changed my idea to kind of, this is some of my overhead projection stuff. This is me rear projecting in costume with a collaborator, Christine Fellows from Winnipeg on the right, but on the left it's just me working with kind of paper cutouts. And I would do rear projection, performative movement, but also a lot of drawing and acetate kind of stuff. This is 3 overhead projectors, old school, you might recognize those, very analog, with cutouts, miniature of photography that I researched and collage to create a map on a 3-dimensional sculpture. This was in the Venice Biennale. It's kind of impossible to really see what's going on with that, but that is a projection as well with the overheads. So I've been working with these overheads for years, and they're super inspiring to me, and I also, the part of Earthlings, the exhibition that I co-curated at the Esker Foundation in Calgary in 2017, worked with some really incredible artists that are coming from Nunavut, some Inuit artists, and one of the pieces that I contributed to the show was called Axis and Revolution. So it was 31 really small miniature terracotta figures responding to kind of political situations of 2016, which was quite a monumental year. And so I wanted to work with the idea of the shadow puppets, work with these small figures and think about the parade or the activist march and how the grassroots kind of really is one of the biggest agents of change through history, the people. So here's the pieces being fired in my kiln when they were still greenware at that point. And then here's the piece when it is fired. It looks kind of short or condensed in that picture maybe, but it's a beautiful long sculpture with all these little individuals, and each one of them has a story. And as you can see, I painted the shadow spotlights on the wall. I completed this in the very end of 2020, so you can see there's even some masks involved. A lot of the drawings that I made in the exhibition were created in Norway. I went to an artist residency in Norway, and I spent 2 months creating drawings inspired by the histories of puppetry, ballet, dance of all forms, kind of theatrical movement on stages, and to kind of work through some images or ideas around gender, family, power structures, and the creativity of the artists. Here's Punch again, working from the great Bill Bard, who's a really famous and amazing puppet artist from the States, his version of Punch. Here I have kind of a mashup with some images of the Catholic Church, which I found very menacing. This image I really love because I feel like there's no way I can explain this image to you. And I wonder what you think. And I also gave myself the challenge while I was in Norway to really go deeply into investigating the intersection of perception or identity that involves whiteness. Because I am a white woman that comes from Scarborough, Ontario, and I have a certain era that I was brought up in, and I was socialized in Canada, and like John made that beautiful contextualization of history. We're all involved in that history, so I think a lot about my place in it. And I wonder, how can I, as a white artist, talk about whiteness and explore that white culture, white identity, white harm, white supremacy, what are those things? And so that was a really wild challenge for me to try to think of images. And so I thought to break it down along gender lines, because that has been, the intersections of gender really play a part in whiteness and race, as everybody's race they do in every culture. So I tried to think about some very difficult things around patriarchy. I come from a very strongly gendered family, so I was really informed by this stuff and kind of harmed by it myself, always trying to break it down and think of different ways to look at it. So also, sad but true, there has been an uprise of gun violence that we've all watched happen over the years in the world, and particularly the States and sometimes in Canada. And let's say 99% of it has been perpetuated by white men, white boys. And we have to wonder, why is nobody talking about that? What is going on with the socialization of white men, that this is becoming an avenue of violence and release for those young men. There's something happening. We know what's happening, I think, on a lot of levels. We don't really know how to stop that or how to intervene or change the history of how men are socialized and how women are socialized. I wanted to talk about that with lone gunmen. I also thought about settler, which on the right is about the kind of origins of how whiteness is just a construction, as is blackness or any other kind of identity based on skin color. It was just something that was created in order to kind of justify exploitation of each other. And so unfortunately, Europeans kind of created the idea of black people. No one ever called anybody from Africa or other parts of the world that had dark skin black before. They were just who they were from where they were and whatever. But when global movements started to happen, all of a sudden, when the slave trade, there's always been slavery too, of all sorts of peoples. When, from what I understand, European, Portuguese slave trade kind of moved into Africa and saw an opportunity to have a lot of wealth extracted from that country. They created the idea of black people, which were never, that didn't exist. But that was existed as a way to justify a hierarchy of peoples. And so that's when whiteness started to get a bump up. And then as America and Canada were settled, America first, slavery was brought in, but also indentured servants of whiteness. A lot of white poor people were kind of enslaved, working for early colonies for more nobility in those early days that we can barely remember. And in the early days, those poor people, whether they were identified as having a different skin color or white skin color, people weren't really thinking of themselves as white. They were just poor. And they started to hang out together, connect across those race or cultural backgrounds. And the threat that created with when people fall in love and start to get to know each other across race and cultural lines, that's very threatening to people on the top that are trying to keep a status hierarchy so that their wealth is secure and no one's going to uprise and question, hey, why are we slaves? Why are we at the bottom here? Why is our labor so exploited? So a separation was necessary, and anti-miscegenation laws were created by white men in America to make it illegal for white women to marry black men. And that was in order to keep people separate. And also, that's when white people started to get a little bit of status bump. Whether you were poor, you're a little bit above other people. And then that keep people happy. The white people are a little bit happy even if they were poor. And I see that now to this day when you see, I know this is very contentious and some people might be offended by a character like Donald Trump, getting a lot of working class white people very angry and very upset and very threatened about immigration and other people from other parts of the world. I really see those same laws and rules being kind of used to whip up fear and frenzy and used to be like, I'm always amazed that working class people are so susceptible to feeling a little bit more prestige by someone like Donald Trump, who is so wealthy and so exploitative of all labor practices, but somehow feeling, okay, well, we're white, we're poor, but at least we have Donald Trump, like he's one of us. So there's a lot of class manipulation going on there for people. And it's gone on for a long time, and we're kind of blind to it. And so I really want to explore that with Settler. And it's, she's smoking marijuana, which is such a common thing now. Everybody smokes. So many people smoke. There's marijuana shops everywhere in Toronto. Over COVID, it went wild. And I used to smoke a lot of marijuana when I was young as a kind of painkiller. But I stopped doing it, and I have zero judgment about it. But I just know that it does numb you, and it can kind of make you forget. It's known as that. Your memory gets a little bit bad. And I think a lot of the bad habits we're in socially, we do a lot to try to forget about them because they're so painful. So that's where White Elephant comes in, and I created White Elephant with the help of some really extraordinary artists and makers in their own rights. I was approached by Kafka, which is a contemporary art forum, Kitchener area in Ontario, to do a large public sculpture. Back in 2017, they first approached me, and I came back to them saying, can I make a giant sculpture about whiteness? And they were like, whoa. That's wild. Okay, whoa. Because even the conversation, racialized people have been talking about whiteness and white supremacy forever because they're the ones impacted by it. But us white people have been oblivious to it because it's not our problem, right? Like, we don't get impacted by it, so we're not even thinking about it. But what happens when we start thinking about it? I think we have to start talking amongst ourselves and finding ways to be comfortable to talk about it, and then talk about each other. Because just like misogyny or patriarchy, I don't think women are going to be solving that all by themselves. Men have to get involved, and I feel it's the same. The amount of labor that racialized people take on to try to talk about racism, we know the kind of harms that in itself endlessly puts on their shoulders and puts it in their way. But as a white person, I can talk about it. It's not quite as dangerous for me, and I think that's my duty, to try to have a conversation and bring it up so it's not so uncomfortable. There's a lot of shame and guilt in our culture that makes us feel quiet, and we don't want to say the wrong thing, we don't want to mess up, and we don't want to be accused or kind of pointed out in that way. But it's actually, I've been doing it now for about 3 years, and it's not that bad. I can tell you, no trapdoor has yet opened up that I've fallen into and disappeared. Maybe some people would like me to disappear, but we'll see how that goes. White elephant is a possession which its owner cannot dispose of, and whose cost, particularly that of the maintenance, is out of proportion to its usefulness. And I thought that was a great description, because a white elephant's like a garage sale where people just try to sell the things that they don't want anymore, but they have a big attachment to them, and they don't want them to go for that cheap. So it's hard to let go of privilege. It's hard to let go when you get a little bit of status. I think that's actually also humans, and also we are, remember, primates. And primates always are vying for status. Who's on top, That's it's very genetically hardwired, but there's a lot better way. Like, we're better than our hardwiring. I think we can contend with this stuff. I was also inspired by The Exorcist, which is a film some people might have seen from the 70s, back when the church had more of a grip, like the Christian church had more of a grip on people's nightmares, and they were so afraid of the devil. And so the idea of being possessed was something that really could scare the crap out of you, and there was a lot of horror films about that at the time. And I saw this, and the idea that a child, and also usually a little girl would somehow be possessed. And I saw this much too young on television, so it really gave me nightmares forever. But I really thought, again, to look back at Jordan Peele, about the idea of using the trope of horror to talk about racism is really brilliant. Because I think it asks you to use empathy to say, how horrifying is it to just have people come at you and want to cause you harm, all the way to want to cause you death, just because of the skin that you're in. Like, pigmentation is, we all have hair and fingernails and eyeballs. Like, it's crazy to have such, to be so vulnerable for something you have no control over. So I think about the kind of outsized legacies of whiteness, the gigantic kind of nature of being centered all the time. That was a risk I took with this project too. When you're a white person talking about whiteness, all of a sudden I am on a stage with a microphone. Who gets the stage? Another white person. So I knew that was going to be kind of problematic, but I also knew that if I didn't do it, and we don't try to do things that are kind of a little bit wrong, a little bit not perfect, that no one tries anything. So sometimes we got to fail a little bit just to try, just to keep the door open, keep the conversation going. People will do this far better than I, and the conversation will be bigger and wider and longer, and in years down the road, there will be all sorts of people comfortably talking about this, and hopefully it's just going to push this into a better and better place for all of us. But for now, I have my own self-distortions, as we all do, where we all are a little blind to ourselves. So again, I point to the beautiful catalog that goes along with this exhibition, and I had the opportunity to write my personal thoughts about this stuff in the back of the catalog with all my early references and images that I was looking at when I made the work. There's also this incredible artist talk that I made with specifically around White Elephant, that's on YouTube, that you can look up, Artist Talk with Shary Boyle, Making of White Elephant. If anybody wants to dig a little further, I have a lot of great imagery and kind of research tools that are in there. And then I want to introduce Colin Harry, who was my collaborator on the mechatronics of White Elephant. And I often look at the beautiful box that he made, and he's an electrician, he's a robotics expert, he's a maker and a creator and an envisioner of how mechanical systems can operate for artists and robots. So he's got a really wide skill set, completely different than mine, and that White Elephant couldn't be alive without Colin. Colin made it live. He gave it its heart and its brain. And so that I will always bring him into this conversation because, I feel like also the conversations we had as a white woman and a black man as we created this over years were fundamental to my kind of, sense of relationship and gratitude to, all the racialized people I've had in my life that have given me information, have shared spaces with me, have, given slowly kind of maybe opened conditional trust with me, which is, I will forever be grateful and hopefully worthy of. So Colin is just a good friend now, and we had so many laughs, and he loves to talk about philosophy just like me. He designed the armature, lightweight armature that breaks apart at the joints so it can be separated and crated, which is really important when it's going to be traveling around the country. So kind of a genius system. And then also he came up with the motor that was going to work to spin the head of White Elephant. And here is a wonderful woman named Alexa McMaster that comes from Halifax as well, and she works in theater, and she helped me as an assistant to kind of do some of the carving of the body because it was a big job. There's a lot of labor involved, and I needed one person to help. So the body is made out of styrofoam, all connected, and then I carved it down. I made the hands out of porcelain, the head out of porcelain. Here's some of the casts of the head until I got it, and I painted it, and it worked in the kiln correctly. And then here's Colin working on wiring the motor. He also programmed it, he coded it. He's kind of a code master as well. And here's the sweater, the design of the sweater. I worked with Juliana Wilding, who's a costume designer, works on television and film. I knew that I wanted that really beautiful sweater. It's so amazing. I wish I had a sweater like that. But I'm like, it's so Sears catalog and like prim white. I couldn't imagine a more like white sweater. So I was like, that's the sweater. And so we got the, I think I even have an image of that's a knitting machine. It's something that's kind of obsolete now, but in the 80s, there are these machines that were made that people could buy in the public that knit, it's like a player piano, where the pattern of the knit, you could put in like a code on a piece of paper. Is fascinating. And then it spits out the yardage, but you have to kind of, got these you have to watch it because it can get all tangled. They're a pain in the ass, and that's why they became obsolete. But it was the only way I could pump out yards and yards and yards of when you see the sweater is one of the coolest things in the show. It's 5 feet tall. It's the most amazing thing. And Juliana took that yardage, and I measured it all out, and she helped sew it together into the sweater you see. Here's Heather Goodchild, who is a fabric artist, a painter, a rug hooker, and an amazing pattern maker, and she created this Italian wool trousers with satin lining for the sculpture, based again on those amazing Sears catalogs, images from the 80s that I really remember. And then here I am putting in the tracks of hair. So they're individually tracked, tons of synthetic hair that go into the head, bedded in with epoxy compound. And then when I had a massive amount of long hair, you can't get hair like that short, so then I had to hire Dallas Wagner, who's a hairstylist, to come and cut the hair and give it the style that I wanted. That was a wild job for her. It took her about 3 hours, and the hair was so thick at the end she just broke the scissors. She did a great job. So by the time something like this happens, it's years of labor and planning and research and prototypes and trials, tests, errors, fails, it's an amazing project, and there's so many beautiful people involved, and so much great conversation and so much care in the detail of the making. It's a monument to the hand skills of so many people. And then, you see an idea in your head. What's head spinning? Racism. What's head spinning and confusing? Being white. It makes your head spin. You don't know how to make it better. where do you go? How do you put your foot forward? Sometimes people get so confused about it, they just kind of spin. But then there's also the terror aspect of it. So I thought that as a gesture, as one little gesture that I could do to put into a gallery, as a prompt for conversation, the head spin was it. And then you also have to dress its hair all the time, because its hair gets crazy. So part of the conservator's job here, and they've got a really wonderful conservator here at the Mackenzie, is once a week she has to get up on a ladder and comb out the hair and kind of detangle it and stuff, because by the end of the week it looks like they've gone on like 4,000 roller coasters. So all together, these are small little aspects of how I think and what I imagine and how, we might experience all the little tiny parts that make us who we are. But really who we are is untenable. It's not one thing. It's not just our race or just our gender or just our family. It's 1,000 things that we don't even have words for. And I want to keep really championing and asking us all as humans to remember that, because that's what we all share. That humanity is kind of where we go when we sleep at night, the things that are in our imaginations and our dreams and our hopes and the stuff that we don't even know how to talk about. That's what we all share. That's what we all have in common. And that's what really is the most beautiful thing about being human. And I do sometimes worry that we do kind of break down our identities to such rigid silos that we don't know how to relate. Like, oh, you're that and I'm that. But we have to watch out for that. We have to honor it and see how those have been used against us and pitted against each other. But ultimately, it's the thing that really has nothing to do with relationship and being alive. So the show kind of ends here when you come back around at the end and you see the back of these characters and you get a chance to look through their eyes and try to even imagine what's in their head. How do we know? We can never know what's in another person's head, but we can try to communicate and make spaces that are safe enough that we might be vulnerable to try. And I feel like art is a really beautiful, and I'm very honored to have a life in the arts. It's not easy. It's difficult and it's painful, and there's a lot of insecurity and economic instability and doubt and self-doubt. I've been at it a long time, but I wouldn't trade it for anything, because I get to think about this stuff constantly, and I get to use my hands to talk about it. And then the most important thing is everybody that comes out. So that you came out tonight and you're listening to me, that's a great honor. I get to have this voice, but also I hope that this sparks something for you all, and you get to talk to your friends and family or just think about it yourself and get something about it that you can't get anywhere else, really, other than, say, visual art. That's it. Thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes for questions. If you want to jet and go, if you've been sitting long enough, please feel free, no offense. And if you want to stick around and have a few questions, I'm totally open for that. And then I'll also be lingering around later up in the gallery too. If you want to come up, I'll be there a little bit.
I think we have time for one question.
Oh, that puts the pressure on.
So
I take any question. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Okay, first hand up. Where's one? Oh my gosh, nobody. Oh, what? We got one there. Hold on.
I'm curious about the sort of black hole behind the head-spinning white elephant. If you could talk a little about that.
I didn't talk about that, and that's a nice segue into, in a way, Crystal Mowry, those two target-looking images, one's behind Judy and one's behind White Elephant, they're the final sequences in any Looney Tunes cartoons that you might have seen where it says, "That's all, folks." So you might have noticed that from cartoons that are on reruns, depending on what age you are. But I think they still play on reruns now for kids. But it's the Looney Tune kind of sign-off that says, "That's all, folks." And for me, I think about that because when I was a kid, I watched a lot of cartoons, and that would always kind of sign off like it's the end. But then the next day, it would be there again. And it would be the end. And the next day, it would be there again and again and again. And I guess I was thinking about some of these really intractable problems that we have, where it is around different power structures that hurt people, and some people feel like they're part of it and they're not, and all these things, that it's hard to make them solve them. It's hard to make them go away, and we want them just to stop. But they don't just stop, and people have been fighting for so long to make them stop. They're exhausted. They're like, come on already. But it seems like it's going to be a very long road. Like, we can't make it seem to stop. Unless, I think that if aliens came down, we'd have a better chance. I'm not sure if I want that to happen, but I feel like if aliens came down, we'd all have to unify really fast to figure out who we are as humans. But otherwise, until then, that's all, folks.